The boardroom of Vance Tower was Eleanor Vance's cathedral, and silence was her favorite hymn. 42 floors above the city, the air was thin, cold, and filtered. It smelled of nothing, which was exactly how she liked it. Below her, the sprawling metropolis was a silent, intricate circuit board, a system she understood and, in many ways, controlled. The long, obsidian table reflected the strained faces of her executive team like dark water. Each person was a component, a piece of a machine she had built from scratch, and one of those components was malfunctioning. Mark, her head of market expansion, had just finished his presentation. He stood beside the enormous screen, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. The projected graphs and optimistic forecasts faded to black, plunging the room back into its stark, monochromatic reality. No one spoke. No one dared to. They all looked at Eleanor, waiting for the verdict. She let the silence hang in the air, letting it press down on Mark until he started to visibly shrink. Her eyes, the color of a winter storm, remained fixed on him. She hadn't moved a muscle for the entire 20-minute presentation. Her hands were steepled in front of her, her dark hair pulled back into a severe chignon so tight it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. She wore a charcoal gray suit, tailored with architectural precision. It was armor. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the room with the chilling finality of a closing steel door. "Mark," she said, and the single word was an indictment. "You have brought me a fantasy." Mark swallowed. "Eleanor, the data models from the southeast sector show a 92% probability of—" "I am not interested in your probabilities," she interrupted, her tone dangerously soft. "Probabilities are guesses dressed up in expensive software. I am interested in facts, and the fact is your entire proposal is built on a foundation of sand." She unlaced her fingers and picked up a single sheet of paper from the stack in front of her. It was a summary of his report, which she had read at 5 o'clock that morning. "Page 3, she said, not looking at it. "You cite the Henderson acquisition as your primary precedent for rapid market absorption." She paused. "Did you read the post-mortem analysis our risk assessment team compiled on the Henderson deal?" Mark's face went pale. I reviewed the executive summary." A flicker of something, not anger, but a profound, weary disappointment, crossed Eleanor's face. "The executive summary," she repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "The children's version. You are asking me to risk $300 million based on the children's version." She let the paper drift from her fingers. It floated down to the table with a soft, dismissive whisper. "If you had read the full 700-page report, Mark, you would know that the Henderson acquisition almost bankrupted us. You would know that their supply chain was a catastrophic mess held together by handshake deals and outright fraud. You would know that the only reason we survived it was because I personally spent 3 weeks in a damp warehouse in another country rebuilding their logistics from the ground up." Her gaze swept across the other faces at the table. They stared at the polished surface, at their hands, anywhere but at her. Fear was a useful tool. It ensured compliance. It enforced order. "This company was not built on guesses," Eleanor continued, her voice a low, steady thrum. "It was built on brutal, unforgiving facts. It was built on sleepless nights and an obsessive attention to every single detail. It was built on the principle that there is no room for error, not 1 inch." She looked back at Mark, who now seemed to be having trouble breathing. "Your proposal is not just flawed, it is lazy. It is an insult to every person in this company who actually does the work. You took a shortcut, hoping I wouldn't notice." A faint, mirthless smile touched her lips. "I notice everything." She leaned back in her chair, the leather groaning softly. "The project is dead. Clean out your desk. Human resources will have your severance package ready by noon." There was a collective, silent intake of breath around the table. Mark stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. He had been with the company for 8 years. 8 years, erased in less than 2 minutes. He had a family, a mortgage. Eleanor knew this. She also knew that weakness was a virus. If she allowed one person to get away with mediocrity, it would spread. Chaos would follow. And chaos was the one enemy she could not tolerate. "Get out," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. It was more terrifying than any shout. Mark stumbled backward, knocking into his chair. He turned and fled the room without another word, the heavy door swinging shut behind him with a quiet hydraulic hiss. Eleanor turned her attention to the remaining executives. "The rest of you," she said, her tone businesslike once more. "I want a new expansion strategy on my desk by Monday, one that is based on reality, not on fairy tales. Is that understood?" A chorus of mumbled "Yes, Eleanor" filled the room. "Good," she said, gathering her papers into a neat, perfect stack. "The meeting is adjourned." She stood, and the rest of the board rose with her, a synchronized, fearful ballet. They parted to let her pass, their eyes downcast. She walked from the boardroom without a backward glance. The sound of her heels on the polished Italian marble was the only sound in the vast, silent hallway. Her personal office was just down the corridor, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a 180-degree view of the city. The space was as minimalist and controlled as she was. A large chrome and glass desk, a single black leather chair. No clutter, no personal effects, save for one small, silver-framed photograph tucked into a corner of the desk. It was a picture of her daughter, Lily. In the photo, Lily was 7 years old, a gap-toothed smile on her face, her long brown hair caught in the wind. She was holding up a dandelion, about to make a wish. Eleanor had taken the photo last spring. During a rare weekend, she had allowed herself to take off completely. She sank into her chair, the cold leather of familiar comfort. For a moment, she allowed her gaze to rest on the photograph. Lily was her one exception, her one vulnerability. In a world of rigid rules and calculated risks, her daughter was the one variable she could not control, and the only one she loved with a terrifying, absolute fierceness. Everything she did, every ruthless decision she made, every empire she built, it was all, in the end, for Lily. To create a world for her that was safe, stable, perfect. A fortress against the chaos that had defined Eleanor's own childhood. A soft chime from her computer pulled her from her thoughts. An alert. A new acquisition target was vulnerable. Her mind immediately shifted, the brief moment of softness gone, as if it had never been. The fortress walls went back up. She began to read, her eyes scanning financial data, her mind already formulating a plan of attack. This was her world. Numbers, strategies, victories. A world of black and white, where emotion was a liability and rules were absolute. She had built Vance Corp on a single, unwavering principle. Perfection is the only acceptable standard. Punctuality was not a suggestion, it was a law. The dress code was not a guideline, it was a uniform. Every employee, from the board members down to the cleaning crew, was expected to adhere to the same impossible standards she set for herself. Order was everything. A hesitant knock on her office door broke her concentration. It was a timid, almost apologetic sound. Only one person in the entire company would dare to knock on her door without being summoned. "Enter," she said, her voice sharp with annoyance. The door opened slowly and her executive assistant, Thomas Green, slipped into the room. Thomas was a young man in his late 20s with neat hair, thin-rimmed glasses, and a perpetual look of someone bracing for impact. He was intensely loyal, impeccably organized, and terrified of her, which made him the perfect assistant. Today, however, his usual anxiety was amplified to a new level. His face was pale and he was wringing his hands. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "I am so sorry to disturb you. I know you're busy." Eleanor did not look up from her screen. "Then I suggest you get to the point, Thomas, before my goodwill evaporates entirely." "Yes, of course. There's a situation, a disruption." Eleanor's fingers stopped moving over the keyboard. A disruption. She hated that word. It implied a breakdown of order, a stain on the pristine fabric of her company. A disruption where? "In the main lobby, Ms. Vance." The Vance Tower lobby was not just an entrance. It was a statement. A vast, cavernous hall of white marble and polished chrome, designed to awe and intimidate. It was the public face of her empire, and she demanded it be flawless at all times. The air was kept at a precise temperature. The only approved sound was the soft murmur of business and the quiet clicking of expensive shoes on the gleaming floor. "What kind of disruption?" she asked, her voice dangerously low. Thomas swallowed hard. It's an employee, Ms. Vance, from the custodial staff. He, he's causing a scene. Eleanor felt a cold knot of fury tighten in her stomach. A janitor, a low-level employee, was making a scene in the heart of her headquarters, in front of clients, investors, and the public. It was an unacceptable breach of protocol, a crack in the fortress. Why hasn't security handled it? She demanded. They tried, Ms. Vance. He's not being aggressive, just refusing to leave. He's insisting he needs to speak with someone from human resources. He's late for his shift and his uniform is torn. He looks unwell. He's bleeding. Bleeding. The word hung in the sterile air of her office. An image flashed in her mind, a messy, uncontrolled, biological reality tainting the clean lines of her lobby. It was disgusting, unprofessional, an affront to everything she had built. He's late, his uniform is damaged, and he is bleeding in my lobby, she summarized, her voice flat and cold. And he is still in the building because he's claiming there was an incident on his way to work. He keeps saying it wasn't his fault, Thomas stammered, looking miserable. Security is hesitant to remove him forcibly. There are a lot of people in the lobby right now. It could become a bigger scene. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Hesitant, another word she despised. Hesitation was a symptom of weakness, a fear of making a necessary, if unpleasant, decision. Security was failing. Her protocols were failing. She stood up. The movement was sudden and decisive, causing Thomas to flinch. You were right to inform me, Thomas. This is no longer a security issue. This is a standards issue. She walked around her desk, her expression a mask of controlled rage. This was not something to be delegated. An example needed to be made. A clear public demonstration of the consequences of breaking the rules. When a part of the machine is broken, you do not coddle it. You remove it swiftly and without sentiment. Cancel my 2 o'clock, she commanded as she strode toward the door. Tell the board the strategy meeting is postponed indefinitely. I will handle this myself. Yes, Ms. Vance, Thomas squeaked, scurrying back to his own desk outside her office. Eleanor didn't slow down. She walked down the long, empty corridor, her mind already processing the situation. Late, disheveled, bleeding, refusing to follow orders. It was a cascade of failures, a complete disregard for the structure that held everything together. The reason for the lateness was irrelevant. The circumstances of the injury did not matter. The only thing that mattered was the violation itself. The rules had been broken publicly, and public transgressions required public corrections. As she stepped into the private elevator, her reflection stared back at her from the polished steel walls. Her face was impassive, her eyes cold. She thought of the perfect, clean lines of her building, the silent, efficient hum of her company. All of it was a testament to her control. This disruption, this messy human problem in her lobby, was a challenge to that control. The elevator descended, the floors flashing by in a silent blur. With each floor, her resolve hardened. She would restore order. She would excise the imperfection. She would remind every single person in that lobby, and by extension, every employee in her global enterprise, that the rules of Eleanor Vance were not guidelines. They were absolute. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the vast expanse of the main lobby. The usual quiet hum was gone, replaced by a tense silence. Dozens of people, employees and visitors alike, were standing in small, nervous clusters, their attention fixed on the center of the room. There, standing alone in the middle of the pristine white marble floor, was a man in a torn and dirty janitor's uniform. Near him, 2 security guards stood uncertainly, their hands hovering near their belts. Eleanor Vance stepped out of the elevator. The air seemed to grow colder. Every head turned towards her. A wave of fear and deference rippled through the crowd as they recognized the formidable figure striding into their midst. She did not look at them. Her gaze was locked on the source of the chaos, the single, unacceptable flaw in her perfect world. She walked forward, the sharp, rhythmic click of her heels on the marble floor, the only sound in the cavernous space. It was the sound of approaching judgment. She entered the lobby, her face a mask of cold fury, ready to restore order by any means necessary. The polished marble floor of Vance Tower was a mirror, reflecting the cold, geometric perfection of the ceiling lights above. Eleanor Vance saw her own sharp silhouette advancing, a dark figure cutting through the vast white space. Her heels clicked with a sound like cracking ice, each step an assertion of ownership. The disruption Thomas had mentioned was a discordant note in her symphony of order, and she was moving to silence it. Her assistant, Thomas, scurried a few paces behind, his own footsteps a nervous, muffled counterpoint to her confident rhythm. The usual low hum of the lobby, a blend of quiet conversations and the swish of automatic doors, had vanished. In its place was a heavy, watchful silence. Dozens of people, employees in their sharp suits and clients in their expensive casual wear, stood frozen. They were arranged in a loose, hesitant circle, their attention fixed on the center of the room. They parted for her like water before a ship's prow, their gazes shifting from the spectacle to her, then quickly away. They knew the storm was coming, and there, at the heart of the silence, was the flaw, the source of the disorder. A man in the gray janitor's uniform of Vance Corp. He stood alone, looking small and out of place under the soaring cathedral-like ceiling. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, taking him in with a single, sweeping and deeply critical glance. The uniform was torn at the shoulder, the fabric rent. There was dirt smudged on one knee of his trousers, but it was his arm that drew her focus. A dark, angry gash, at least 4 inches long, ran along his forearm. It was still bleeding slowly, the blood a shocking slash of deep crimson against his pale skin and the dull gray of his sleeve. He was holding it awkwardly, his fingers stained. This was Samuel Jones. She didn't know his name. Not really. To her, he was simply janitorial staff, a function, a component of the building's ecosystem, meant to be invisible, efficient, and clean. He was currently none of those things. He was visible, he was late, and he was, to her eyes, filthy. He had brought mess and injury and chaos into her pristine lobby. She came to a halt a precise 10 feet from him. The space felt charged, a vacuum waiting for her to fill it with her judgment. Sam looked up, and his eyes met hers. They were blue, tiered, and held a flicker of something she could not immediately categorize. It was not fear, not exactly. It was a deep, bone-weary resignation. "Explain this," Eleanor said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was low and sharp, a shard of glass that cut through the silence and made several onlookers flinch. Sam visibly swallowed. His good hand gestured vaguely toward his torn sleeve and injured arm. "Ma'am, Mrs. Vance, I am sorry I am late," he began, his voice quiet and slightly hoarse. "There was an incident at the park just across the street. I had to—" Eleanor held up a single, perfectly manicured hand. The motion was small, but absolute. It stopped his words as effectively as a gag. "I am not interested in your incidents," she stated, her tone dropping even colder. "I am interested in results. I am interested in standards. I am interested in the image of this company." She took a slow step forward, her gaze sweeping over the silent crowd before returning to him. She was making a point, and he was the lesson. "The rules of this corporation are not suggestions, Mr." She paused, letting her eyes drift to the plastic ID badge clipped to his shirt. The photo showed a less tired version of the man before her. "Jones, the rules are the structure that separates success from failure, order from case. A start time is not a guideline. A dress code is not a recommendation." Her eyes locked back onto his bleeding arm. A wave of revulsion went through her. It was unaesthetic. It was unprofessional. It was a weakness on public display in her temple of strength. Her mind flashed with images of her daughter, Lily. Lily sometimes scraped a knee at the playground, and Eleanor would clean it with antiseptic in a small, neat bandage. It was a private, controlled act of care. This was different. This was a public, uncontrolled failure. This man was bleeding on her floor. Metaphorically, and perhaps soon, literally. "You were due to start your shift 3 hours ago," she continued, her voice relentless. "You arrived not only late, but in this state, torn, bleeding. You have made yourself a spectacle in the main lobby of my global headquarters. Do you have any idea how many contracts are being negotiated on the floors above us? Do you understand that the first impression of Vance Corporation is formed right here, on this floor? Ma'am, please. Sam tried again, a hint of desperation entering his voice. If you would just let me explain. A little girl. Enough, she snapped. The word was sharp, final. There is no explanation that I will accept. You are a representative of this company, whether you are cleaning a toilet or standing in this lobby, and this representation is unacceptable. Inside, a cold certainty settled over her. An example had to be made. Leniency was a cancer. It started with one person being 5 minutes late, and it ended with missed deadlines, failed projects, and corporate collapse. She had built this empire from nothing, working 100-hour weeks, sacrificing relationships, sleep, everything. She did it by never, ever accepting excuses, by demanding absolute perfection from herself and everyone under her. This man, with his torn shirt and his pathetic story waiting on his lips, was an insult to every sacrifice she had ever made. She closed the remaining distance between them until she was standing directly in front of him. He was taller than her, but in that moment, he seemed to shrink under the sheer force of her will. She could smell the faint, coppery scent of his blood, mixed with the stale air of the city clinging to his clothes. "Well, we have a standard of excellence here, Mr. Jones," she said, her voice now barely a whisper, yet it carried across the silent lobby. "You have failed to meet it. Spectacularly." He looked at her, and for a fleeting second, his tired blue eyes held a flash of something else. Not anger, it was closer to pity. The look confused and irritated her. Who was he to pity her? She reached out, her fingers quick and precise. She did not touch his skin. She hooked her forefinger under the lanyard around his neck and yanked. The cheap plastic clip on his shirt pocket gave way with a sharp crack. The ID badge swung free. She held it up between them, his own face staring back at him. "You are finished here," she said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion. It was a simple statement of fact. A collective gasp went through the room. Thomas behind her made a small choke sound. Eleanor ignored it. She looked at the badge, at the name Samuel Jones, and the sterile corporate logo. This plastic card was his connection to her world, and she was severing it. With a deliberate, unhurried motion, she closed her hand around the badge and squeezed. Her knuckles were white. The plastic groaned, then splintered. It was a small, petty act of destruction, but it felt deeply satisfying. It was the restoration of order. She opened her hand and let the broken pieces of his identity fall to the gleaming marble floor. They skittered and came to rest near the toe of his worn work boot. Sam stared at the broken plastic, then back at her. The resignation in his eyes was complete now. He did not argue. He did not plead. He simply nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible dip of his head. That quiet dignity was the most infuriating thing of all. He should have been shouting or crying or begging. His silence felt like a judgment she could not understand. "Security," Eleanor called out, her voice regaining its normal, commanding volume. She did not turn her head. She did not need to. Two uniformed guards who had been hovering near the main entrance immediately stepped forward. They were large men, their expressions neutral, but their movements were tense. They had seen her anger before, but rarely this public. "Escort this man from the premises," Eleanor commanded, her back now turned to Sam. She was already walking away, the matter concluded. "Ensure he does not return." She heard the guards' quiet voices. "Sir, please come with us." She did not look back. To look back would be to acknowledge that the event had any lingering importance. It was over. The problem was solved. A faulty component had been removed. The machine would now run smoothly again. She walked toward the main elevator bank, the crowd parting before her once more, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. No one met her eyes. Good. Fear was a more reliable motivator than respect. As she waited for the elevator, she saw the reflections in the polished chrome doors. Sam was walking between the two guards. He wasn't struggling. He moved with a slight limp she hadn't noticed before. His shoulders were slumped, but his head was not bowed. He held his injured arm close to his body. As they reached the revolving glass doors, he paused for a moment and looked back. Not at her, but at the entire lobby, as if memorizing it. Then the guards gently guided him through and he was gone, swallowed by the city outside. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. The doors slid open. Eleanor stepped inside alone. As the doors slid shut, she saw her own reflection one last time. Her hair was perfectly in place. Her suit was immaculate. Her expression was serene, controlled. The disruption was gone. The lobby was silent. The floor was perfect, save for a few forgotten, broken pieces of plastic that the next janitor would be instructed to sweep away. Order had been restored, and in that moment, Eleanor Vance felt nothing but the cold, clean satisfaction of a job well done. The silent ascent in the chrome elevator was a return to form, a cleansing. Below, the lobby and its brief, messy disruption shrank into irrelevance. The incident was over. Order had been restored. The system was functioning correctly again. Eleanor Vance watched the floor numbers climb, her reflection a pale, severe shape against the polished steel. She felt nothing but a cool, distant satisfaction. A loose thread had been snipped. That was all. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing her penthouse suite. Her executive assistant, Thomas Green, stood waiting just outside. He looked pale, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. He opened his mouth, perhaps to offer some useless, placating words about the scene downstairs. Eleanor didn't give him the chance. "The Aperture Labs acquisition," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet air as she swept past him. "I want the final security audit on my desk. Now. And cancel my 4 o'clock. This is more important." "Yes, Mrs. Vance," he stammered, scrambling to keep up. "Right away." The heavy oak door to her private office closed behind her with a solid, definitive thud. The sound sealed her in and locked the rest of the world out. Here she was in absolute control. The chaos of human fallibility could not reach her. Her office was less a room and more a statement. It was a glass-walled fortress perched atop the city with a view that stretched to the hazy horizon. The skyline was a collection of lesser kingdoms, all under the gaze of her tower. She walked to the immense window, placing her palms flat against the cool, unyielding glass. Down below, tiny cars moved along grid-like streets. People were just specks, components in a vast machine. For the machine to run smoothly, every component had to perform its function perfectly, without exception. The janitor, Samuel Jones, had been a faulty part. His tardiness, his torn uniform, his bleeding arm. They were not signs of a struggle or a story she needed to hear. They were symptoms of failure, a failure to adhere to the simple, clear standards of Vance Corporation. She had not been cruel. She had been precise. She had performed a necessary, albeit public, system correction. The dozens of employees in the lobby had been given a valuable lesson. The rules were not abstract guidelines. They were the steel framework that kept the entire structure from collapsing into chaos. Compassion was a weakness. Excuses were the rust that weakened the frame. She had spent her entire life fighting against that kind of decay. Returning to her desk, she sank into the embrace of her black leather chair. It sighed under her weight, a familiar and comforting sound. With a few swift clicks of her mouse, the Aperture Labs files filled the trio of monitors before her. This was her true element. Not the messy, unpredictable world of people, but the clean, logical world of data. She began to read, her mind shifting into a state of pure cold analysis. Server encryption protocols, backdoor vulnerabilities, potential for industrial espionage. Her eyes scanned lines of code and risk assessment charts. Her mind moved with a speed and clarity that left others breathless. She found a flaw in their firewall infrastructure, a tiny, elegant mistake that a lesser mind would have missed. A small smile touched her lips. It was a beautiful vulnerability, an open door waiting for her to walk through. She would own this company within 6 months. She leaned toward the intercom. "Thomas," she said, her voice perfectly level, "draft a memo to the legal team. I want a contingency plan for a hostile takeover of Aperture. Focus on exploiting their network security flaws. I've sent you the data points. I want the draft by end of day." "A hostile takeover, Mrs. Vance?" Thomas's voice crackled back, tinged with surprise. "Our current offer was for a friendly merger." "Circumstances have changed," Eleanor replied, her eyes still fixed on the screen. "They have demonstrated a lack of discipline in their digital infrastructure. I can no longer trust them as partners. We will acquire them, dismantle their sloppy systems, and rebuild them to our standard. She cut the connection before he could reply. It was the same principle as the janitor. Weakness must be purged, not accommodated. Aperture Labs was just a larger version of Samuel Jones. Unkempt, unreliable, a risk. And she did not tolerate risk. For the next 2 hours, Eleanor was lost to the world. She worked with a ferocious, single-minded intensity. The city outside her window darkened as the afternoon wore on, but she didn't notice. The only light in the room came from the glow of her monitors, reflecting in her focused gray eyes. She dictated memos, analyzed financial models, and constructed a legal framework for the corporate raid. In her mind, she was a general on a battlefield, moving armies of data and capital. She felt a grim sense of purpose. This was what she was built for. This was how she protected her empire, how she provided the perfect, secure life for the one person who mattered. The thought surfaced without warning, a single ray of warmth in the cold machinery of her mind. Lily. She glanced at the small, sleek digital clock at the bottom of her screen. 3:28 p.m. The intensity in her posture eased. She leaned back, rolling her shoulders. The muscles in her neck were tight. She closed the aperture files one by one until her screens were blank and dark. The silence in the office deepened. Her work was done for now. Another part of her day was about to begin. The most important part. From a locked drawer in her desk, she retrieved a simple silver frame. It held a photo of her daughter, Lily, who was 8 years old. In the picture, Lily was on a swing at the park, her head thrown back in a fit of laughter. Her brown hair flew out behind her like a cape. Around her neck was the delicate butterfly necklace Eleanor had given her for her last birthday. Its tiny sapphire wings seemed to sparkle even in the photograph. Eleanor ran her thumb over the glass, a gesture so gentle it was completely at odds with the woman who had just plotted the destruction of another company. She had built this entire world, this tower, this empire for this one small, laughing girl. All the rules, all the ruthlessness, it was all a wall to keep the chaos of the world away from her, to keep Lily safe, to ensure her world was always as bright and carefree as it was in that picture. She remembered the day she fired Lily's first nanny. The woman had been 5 minutes late, blaming traffic. Eleanor had dismissed her on the spot. Lily's safety depends on punctuality, she had said, her voice devoid of emotion. Traffic is a variable you should have planned for. Your employment is not. The memory brought a flicker of justification. See? The rule was universal. It applied to a nanny just as it applied to a janitor. It was about principle, not position. It was about protecting what was important. The janitor's tardiness was a crack in the wall. She had simply sealed it. The thought settled her, calming the faintest, most unwelcome whisper of doubt. The clock on her monitor turned to 3:30 p.m. It was time. She placed the photo frame back in its drawer, locking it carefully. The moment of softness was over. Now was the routine. She picked up the receiver of her private line, a direct, untraceable phone that bypassed the company switchboard. The polished black plastic was cool against her skin. She dialed the 10 digits of the nanny's mobile phone, a number she knew as well as her own. The tones were sharp, precise beeps in the quiet room. 1, 2, 3. The call connected. She leaned back in her chair, a faint private smile forming. She pictured the scene. Sarah, the nanny, would be at Northwood Park with Lily. Lily would probably be trying to feed her sandwich to the ducks, and Sarah would be gently scolding her. Lily would grab the phone and her bright, happy voice would fill Eleanor's ear. "Hi, Mommy," she would shout. "We saw a dog with a red ball." Eleanor waited for that sound, that small, perfect piece of her day. The line clicked. It was live. But there was no cheerful greeting. There was no "Hello, Mrs. Vance." There was no sound of a child's laughter or a playground's happy noise. There was only silence for a half second. It was a dead, empty space that felt wrong. Then a sound came through the receiver that made the blood in Eleanor's veins turn to ice. It was a breath, a sharp, ragged gasp for air, like someone who had been running for their life. And then came the sob. It was not a sound of sadness. It was a choked, desperate, animal sound of pure, undiluted terror. a whimper from the very edge of panic, from a place where all order had been shattered. A choked sound came through the phone. It was not a word, but the wet, ragged noise of someone trying to speak through tears. For a single cold second, Eleanor felt a familiar flash of irritation. Incompetence. Emotional displays were a failure of composure, and she had no time for them. She had a global network to manage, a multi-billion-dollar acquisition to finalize. She did not have time for a nanny's hysterics. Her voice was sharp, a tool honed to cut through such nonsense. Maria, compose yourself and speak clearly. What is it? The city sprawled out beneath her, a silent, orderly grid of lights and steel from her penthouse office. Everything in its place, everything under control. Another sob, this one more desperate, laced with a word that made the air in the room freeze. Lily. Eleanor's posture didn't change. Her hand did not tremble. But inside her chest, something immense and glacial shifted. A deep, primal cold began to spread from her core, seeping into her veins. What about Lily? She asked. Her voice was quieter now, dangerously so. The irritation had vanished, replaced by a stillness that was far more terrifying. The park, the nanny Maria finally gasped out. The words came in a torrent, disorganized and frantic. Northwood Park. We were by the swings. Lily was chasing a butterfly. Oh God, Mrs. Vance, I'm so sorry. Maria, Eleanor's voice was a razor's edge. Tell me what happened, now. She pushed her chair back from the vast mahogany desk, her knuckles white where she gripped the phone. The scent of polished wood and expensive air freshener suddenly seemed suffocating. Two men, Maria wailed, her voice breaking completely. They came out of nowhere. One of them, he grabbed me. The other one went for Lily. The world tilted. The orderly grid of city lights outside her window blurred into a meaningless smear. Eleanor could feel her own heartbeat, a frantic, hammering drum against her ribs. Grabbed her. Went for Lily. The words were not just words. They were images, blooming like toxic flowers in her mind. A strange man's hands on her daughter. Lily's small, trusting face twisted in fear. Her butterfly necklace, the one Eleanor had fastened around her neck just this morning, catching the light as she was pulled away. A low sound escaped Eleanor's own throat, a guttural noise of pure denial. Where is she? She demanded, the question tearing from her. Maria, where is my daughter? She's safe, Maria cried, sensing the raw panic she had unleashed. Oh, thank God, she's safe. We're at St. Michael's Hospital. The police said to come here. They wanted to check her over. Relief was a tidal wave, so powerful it almost buckled Eleanor's knees. She sank into her leather chair, the strength leaving her body in a rush. Safe. The word was an anchor in a swirling vortex of horror. Lily was safe. For a moment, that was all that mattered. The cold in her veins receded, replaced by a weak, trembling warmth. But the CEO in her, the woman who processed data and demanded explanations, took over an instant later. How? She asked, her voice still strained. You said two men. How is she safe? What happened to them? There was a pause on the other end, filled with the sound of Maria taking a shaky breath. A man, she said, her voice full of awe and confusion. A stranger. He was there. He just appeared. Eleanor's mind raced through security protocols, threat assessments, a Rolodex of enemies she had made over the years. Was this a planned intervention? One of her own security details that she was unaware of? Who was he? Eleanor pressed. Did he have a weapon? Was he police? No, Maria said quickly. He wasn't police. He was just a man. He was wearing a uniform, I think. It was torn and dirty, like a janitor or a maintenance worker. He didn't say anything. He just moved. A janitor. The word hung in the air between them, dissonant and strange. A janitor. Why would Maria remember that detail? A torn, dirty uniform. A flicker of an image surfaced in Eleanor's mind, unbidden. A man standing in her pristine lobby just hours ago, a gash on his arm, a torn uniform, the face tired and resigned. Samuel Jones. She pushed the image away. It was a meaningless coincidence. A distraction. Her mind was playing tricks on her, connecting unrelated events in a moment of extreme stress. He fought them, Maria continued, her voice gaining a frantic energy. He was so fast, Mrs. Vance. I've never seen anything like it. He put himself between them and Lily. He took a hit for her. I saw it. One of them had a piece of pipe or something. But the man, he didn't even seem to notice. He just handled them. It was over so fast. They ran. They just dropped everything and ran away. Eleanor stood up again, the phone pressed hard against her ear. She paced the length of the Persian rug, the soft wool doing nothing to cushion the hard, rhythmic impact of her heels. A janitor. Fought them off. Put himself between them and Lily. The details were colliding in her head, creating a picture that made no sense. Heroes in her world wore expensive suits and wielded contracts and market influence. They did not wear torn janitor uniforms and fight attackers in public parks. And this man, the janitor? Eleanor asked, her throat tight. Where is he now? Is he with you at the hospital? I need to speak with him. He's gone, Maria whispered. By the time I got to Lily to make sure she was okay, he was just gone. He limped away. He was hurt, I think. His arm was bleeding before, but it was worse after. He just vanished back into the trees. The police are looking for him. They called him a hero. Bleeding. His arm was bleeding. The image of Samuel Jones came back, sharp and unavoidable this time. The dark, ugly gash on his forearm, the way he held it, as if trying to hide the injury. The quiet shame on his face as she berated him for his appearance. The way his shoulders slumped when she ripped the ID badge from his chest. No, it couldn't be. The logic was undeniable, but her mind refused to accept it. It was impossible. The universe was not that cruel. It was not that ironic. The man she had publicly destroyed, the man she had cast out for a minor infraction, for a disruption of her perfect order, could not be the same man who had just saved the only thing in the world she truly loved. It was a statistical anomaly, a hallucination brought on by terror. But the details were too specific. A janitor's uniform, a torn sleeve, a bleeding arm, a quiet man who appeared and then vanished. St. Michael's, Eleanor said, her own voice sounding distant and strange. You are at St. Michael's Hospital. Yes, ma'am, in the pediatric emergency wing. Lily is asking for you. Lily is asking for you. The phone slipped from Eleanor's fingers. It hit the polished surface of her desk with a loud clatter before tumbling onto the rug with a muffled thud. The sound was deafening in the silent office. It was the sound of her control breaking. The sound of her entire world, so meticulously built, so ruthlessly managed, shattering into a million irreparable pieces. For a full 5 seconds, she did not move. She simply stood there, staring at the phone on the floor, as if it were a venomous snake. The face of Samuel Jones filled her mind's eye. Not the defiant face of a hero, but the humiliated, broken look of a man she had dismissed like trash. The memory of her own voice echoed in her ears, cold and merciless. Your employment here is terminated. A sound tore from her throat, a raw animal noise that was part scream, part sob. It was a sound no one in Vance Tower had ever heard her make. She was no longer Eleanor Vance, CEO. She was a mother and a monster. She bolted. She didn't grab her coat or her purse. She didn't issue a single instruction. She simply ran, her expensive heels skidding on the marble floor of her private office foyer. She slammed the button for her personal elevator, her knuckles hitting the cool steel over and over again, as if she could physically force it to arrive faster. The doors slid open and she lunged inside, her reflection a distorted mask of horror in the polished walls. A strand of her immaculate dark hair had come loose from its severe chignon and fell across her face. She didn't notice. Her breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The elevator descended, its smooth, silent speed feeling agonizingly slow. Every floor it passed was a lifetime. She saw nothing but Lily's face, terrified. She heard nothing but her own cruel words to Sam. She felt nothing but a hollow, sickening dread that was so immense it felt like it would swallow her whole. The doors opened onto the executive floor. Her assistant, Thomas Green, was standing by his desk, his expression one of mild confusion at the urgent summons of the private elevator. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to ask if she needed something. He never got the chance. Eleanor burst out of the elevator like a force of nature. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a terror he had never seen. She ran past him, her usual precise, commanding stride gone, replaced by a frantic, stumbling sprint. "Mrs. Vance?" he called out, his voice trembling with alarm. She didn't hear him. She was already at the main office doors, shoving them open with a force that made them slam against the walls. The low hum of the open-plan office fell silent as dozens of employees looked up, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. They saw their untouchable, formidable leader, the Iron Woman of finance, in a state of utter disarray. Her jacket was askew, her face was slick with a cold sweat, and her eyes were wild. She didn't see them. She saw only the path to the main elevators at the far end of the floor. She ran, her heels clattering a chaotic rhythm on the polished concrete. Whispers erupted behind her, a wave of confusion and concern rippling through the vast space. "Get the car," she screamed, the words raw and torn from her throat. It wasn't an order to anyone in particular. It was a desperate plea to the universe. "Get the car now." Thomas, snapping out of his shock, fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed the garage. "Henry, bring the car to the front entrance. Now. It's an emergency. I don't know. Just get it there." Eleanor reached the main elevator bank and stabbed the down button repeatedly. She paced in a tight, frantic circle, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold her fracturing body together. She could feel the stares of her employees on her back, but she felt no shame. She felt nothing but a gnawing, all-consuming fear. The elevator arrived. She pushed past two junior analysts who were waiting, their mouths agape. She didn't apologize. She didn't even see them. The doors closed, sealing her in the small, mirrored box once more. Her reflection was even worse now. A woman on the verge of collapse. Her breathing was a painful, wheezing effort. She pressed her forehead against the cool steel wall, closing her eyes. The image of Sam was there again, waiting for her in the darkness. His quiet dignity, the faded scars on his hands, the way he had simply accepted his fate, without argument, without protest. He had taken her verbal blows just as the nanny said he had taken the physical ones. For Lily. The doors opened into the cavernous main lobby, the same lobby where it had happened. The white marble floors seemed to stretch for miles. The air, cool and sterile, felt heavy, thick with the ghost of her own cruelty. She could almost see him standing there, by the chrome pillars, head bowed. She could almost hear the echo of her own voice, sharp and dismissive. She stumbled, catching herself on one of the large marble planters. Security guards started to move toward her, their expressions concerned. But then her driver, Henry, a stout man who had been with her for 10 years, burst through the main glass doors. "Ma'am," he called, his face etched with worry, "the car is here. What's happened?" She didn't answer. She pushed herself off the planter and ran the final stretch, out through the revolving doors and into the noise and gray light of the city afternoon. The sleek black sedan was waiting at the curb, its engine humming, its back door held open by a stunned doorman. Eleanor practically fell into the back seat, landing heavily on the plush leather. Henry was behind the wheel a second later, turning to face her. "Where to, Mrs. Vance? What is it?" "St. Michael's Hospital," she gasped, the words barely audible. "Go. Just go." Henry didn't ask another question. He pulled away from the curb with a controlled squeal of tires, expertly weaving the large car into the dense afternoon traffic. The world outside the tinted windows became a frantic blur of motion and color. Yellow cues, red brake lights, gray buildings. None of it was real. The only real thing was the vice grip of terror around her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. She trembled. It started in her hands, a violent, uncontrollable shaking that she tried to still by clenching them into fists. But the tremor spread, moving up her arms, into her shoulders, until her whole body was vibrating with a panicked energy. She couldn't breathe. She clawed at the collar of her silk blouse, trying to get air, but her lungs refused to cooperate. Each gasp was shallow and useless, bringing no relief. Her car sped through the city, a black arrow of desperation. But for Eleanor Vance, trapped in the cold luxury of the back seat, the car wasn't moving at all. She was frozen in that single horrifying moment of realization. The hero who saved her daughter was the man she had thrown away, and she was racing to see the child he had rescued, while he was somewhere out there hurt and alone, vanished because of her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. There was only the blur of the city, the pounding of her own heart, and the suffocating weight of an unforgivable mistake. The wail of the siren was a blade cutting through the city's drone, but Eleanor Vance heard nothing. The world outside the tinted windows was a meaningless smear of color and light. Her universe had collapsed into the back of this car, into the frantic, useless motion of her hands twisting the leather strap of her handbag. Each red light was a personal attack. Every car that failed to yield was an enemy. Her driver, a man she had employed for a decade, had never seen her like this. She had given him one command: get to the hospital now. And her voice had not been cold or sharp. It had been a raw, fractured thing, the sound of a foundation cracking apart. She was no longer a CEO. She was no longer the architect of an empire. She was a mother hurtling toward the epicenter of her worst nightmare. Her mind was a maelstrom of images, each more terrible than the last. Lily's laugh in the garden, the weight of her small head on Eleanor's shoulder as she slept. The tiny silver butterfly necklace Eleanor had fastened around her neck just last Christmas. Now, those memories were tainted, overlaid with the nanny's choked sobs and the horrifying words, "They tried to take her." Eleanor's breath came in shallow, ragged bursts. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs, desperate for escape. The iron control that had defined her entire adult life had evaporated. There was only a primal, searing terror that consumed every thought, every rational impulse. She felt a scream building in her throat, a sound of pure animal panic, and she bit her lip until she tasted blood, just to hold it in. The car swerved into the ambulance bay of the hospital, stopping so abruptly that Eleanor was thrown forward. She didn't wait for the door to be open. She shoved it open herself, stumbling out into the cacophony of the emergency entrance. The air hit her first, thick with the smell of antiseptic, bleach, and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet. It was the scent of human suffering. The fluorescent lights were merciless, buzzing overhead and casting a sterile, unflattering glare on everything. People rushed past, a blur of scrubs and worried faces. A baby was crying somewhere nearby. A man on a gurney groaned. The noise was overwhelming, a wall of sound that she simply pushed through. "My daughter," she said to the first person she saw, a tired-looking nurse holding a clipboard. "Lily Vance, there was an incident at the park." Her voice was hoarse, unrecognizable. The nurse's eyes softened with professional pity. "She's right through there, ma'am. Bay 4. The police are with her." Eleanor didn't say thank you. She didn't acknowledge the woman further. She just moved, her expensive heels clicking frantically on the polished linoleum floor. Bay 4, the number echoed in her head. She pushed past a curtain, her hand trembling so violently she could barely grasp the cheap plastic material. And then she saw her. Lily was sitting on the edge of an examination bed, her small legs dangling, not quite reaching the floor. She looked impossibly small and fragile under the harsh lighting. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and dried tears, but her eyes, her bright, curious brown eyes, were wide and fixed on her mother. A kind-faced nurse was trying to offer her a cup of water, but Lily wasn't paying attention. Her small fingers were wrapped tightly around the silver butterfly necklace at her throat, clutching it like a lifeline. She was whole. She was breathing. She was there. A sound escaped Eleanor's lips, a choked, guttural sob of air she hadn't realized she was holding. The entire, vast, terrifying world snapped down to this one tiny space, this one small child. The terror that had been strangling her for the last 20 minutes finally gave way, replaced by a wave of relief so powerful it made her knees weak. She took a step forward, then another. The CEO who commanded boardrooms, who dismantled companies with a single word, was gone. In her place was a woman moving toward her child, her entire being focused on that single precious sight. "Mommy," Lily whispered, and her voice was a tiny, broken thing. That one word shattered the last of Eleanor's composure. She closed the distance between them in 2 long strides and fell to her knees in front of the bed. She didn't care about her tailored suit wrinkling on the dirty hospital floor. She didn't care about the nurse or the police officer standing quietly in the corner. She wrapped her arms around her daughter, pulling her from the bed and into a desperate, crushing embrace. She buried her face in Lily's hair, which smelled of grass and playground dust and fear. She held on as if the attackers might reappear at any moment, as if they might still tear her away. Her body was racked with silent, convulsive sobs. Tears streamed down her face, hot and unstoppable, soaking into Lily's jacket. She felt the frailness of her daughter's body, the rapid, frightened beat of her little heart against her own chest. This was real. This was all that mattered. The stocks, the mergers, the billion-dollar deals, the tower with her name on it, it was all just dust, smoke, nothing. This small, warm, breathing child was the only thing of value she had ever possessed. She had almost lost her. The thought was a physical blow, and she clutched Lily tighter, a low sound of pure anguish escaping her throat. "I'm here, baby," she whispered, her voice thick and raw. "I'm here. It's okay. Mommy's here." She repeated the words over and over, a mantra against the darkness that had almost swallowed them both. Lily clung to her small arms wrapped tightly around Eleanor's neck. "They were bad men, Mommy," she cried, her body trembling. "They were scary." "I know, sweetheart. I know." Eleanor rocked her gently, her own body shaking. She kissed the top of Lily's head, her cheek, her forehead, needing the physical proof that she was unharmed. She could feel the delicate chain of the butterfly necklace pressed against her cheek, cold metal against her hot skin. Lily had held on to it. Through everything, she had held on to the one piece of her mother she carried with her. The thought sent another wave of grief and gratitude through Eleanor, so intense it left her breathless. For long minutes, there was nothing else in the world but the sound of their mingled breathing and the quiet, steady rhythm of her own shattered heart beginning to mend. Slowly, the storm inside her began to quiet. The primal fear receded, leaving behind a deep, aching tenderness in a cold, simmering rage. She gently loosened her grip, pulling back just enough to look at her daughter's face. She wiped the tear tracks from Lily's cheeks with her thumbs, her touch uncharacteristically gentle. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice still unsteady. "Did they hurt you anywhere?" Lily shook her head, sniffling. "My arm is scraped." She showed Eleanor a small, raw patch on her elbow, already cleaned and covered with a cartoon bandage by the nurse. Eleanor examined it with the focus she usually reserved for a critical legal document. It was a minor scrape, but to her it was a profound wound, a physical mark of the horror Lily had endured. She pressed a soft kiss to the bandage. "We'll get you home soon," she promised. "We'll get you into your own bed." A throat cleared quietly behind them. Eleanor stiffened, her protective instincts flaring. She turned her head, her eyes sharp and cold once more, ready to dismiss whoever dared to interrupt them. A man in a plain, slightly rumpled suit stood there, his expression patient and empathetic. He held a small notebook. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice calm and respectful. "I'm Detective Millen. I'm sorry to intrude, but I need to ask you and your daughter a few questions when you're ready." Eleanor's first instinct was to command, to demand. "Tell me everything you know. Find them. Use every resource." But the words died in her throat. She was not in her boardroom. The terror had humbled her, stripped her of her usual armor. She looked at the detective, then back at Lily, who was still nestled against her. She took a deep breath, trying to gather the scattered pieces of her authority. "My daughter has been through enough," Eleanor said, her voice low but firm. "She will not be interrogated." "Of course," Detective Miller agreed immediately. "I understand completely. Perhaps you could just tell me what her nanny, Sarah, told you over the phone. We've taken her preliminary statement, but she was quite distressed." Eleanor settled Lily more comfortably on the bed, though she did not let go of her hand. The small fingers squeezed hers tightly. Eleanor began to recount the panicked, fragmented phone call, her voice gaining a bit of its old precision as she focused on the facts. She described the call, the nanny's hysteria, the words, "two men in a van." As she spoke, the reality of the attack became clearer, sharper, and more terrifying. This was not a random act. This was planned. This was targeted. The cold dread returned, coiling in her stomach. This was because of her work, her enemies, Her life had placed her daughter in the path of violence. Detective Miller listened, nodding, making a few notes. That matches what we've gathered from the nanny and a few other witnesses, he confirmed when she finished. It was very fast. They knew what they were doing. They were waiting for a moment when the nanny was distracted. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Professionals. It appears that way, the detective said grimly, which makes what happened next all the more remarkable. Eleanor looked at him, confused. What do you mean? They had her, Mrs. Vance, the detective said, his voice dropping slightly. They had grabbed Lily. According to your nanny, it was over in a second. She screamed, but they were already moving toward the van. He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. They would have been gone, but someone intervened. Eleanor stared at him, her mind struggling to process this. The nanny had said someone helped, a stranger, but in the fog of her panic, the detail had been lost. A man, Detective Miller continued, his eyes holding hers. He came out of nowhere. He wasn't large, not physically imposing, just an ordinary man, but he put himself right between them and your daughter. Eleanor felt a strange sensation, a slow, dawning sense of immense, suffocating debt to a person she did not know. A phantom, a ghost who had stepped out of the crowd to stand where she could not. He fought them, Miller said, a note of quiet admiration in his voice. He didn't have a weapon. He just fought. He gave the nanny enough time to grab Lily and run. The attackers realized they'd lost their chance. They struck him, hard, and then fled before we could get there. Eleanor pictured the scene, a quiet park, the sound of children playing, then sudden brutal violence. And in the middle of it, a faceless hero, a man who had risked his own life for a child he had never met. Who was he? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Did you get his name? I have to thank him. The words felt pathetic, inadequate. How do you thank someone for giving you back your world? What payment could ever equal the life of your child? The detective's expression became regretful. He shook his head slowly. That's the problem. By the time the first patrol car arrived, he was gone. He just blended back into the chaos. No one got a good look at his face. The nanny said he was wearing some kind of uniform, maybe for maintenance or janitorial work. She said he had a fresh injury on his arm, a bad cut that was bleeding. The attackers must have done it. A janitor. The word hung in the sterile air of the hospital room. Eleanor's mind, a machine built for data and patterns, tried to file the information. A janitor had saved her daughter. A man who cleans floors had stood against trained criminals to protect Lily. The social chasm between her world and his was so vast it was almost incomprehensible. She who could buy anything, command anyone, had been utterly helpless. And her daughter's salvation had come from a man whose name she would likely never know, a man whose face she would never see. A wave of profound, disorienting humility washed over her. So he's just gone? Eleanor asked, the frustration and desperation clear in her voice. There's no way to find him. We're looking, Detective Miller assured her. We're checking with local businesses, seeing if any of their staff match the description. But he seemed to want to disappear. He didn't wait for thanks. He didn't wait for the police. He just did what he did and left. Eleanor's mind raced. She would put her own people on it. Her security team, the best private investigators money could buy. She would turn the city upside down to find this man. She owed him a debt that could never truly be repaid. But she had to try. She had to look him in the eye and say the words. The detective seemed to read her thoughts. He gave a small, sympathetic sigh. He didn't leave us much to go on. He was clearly trying to remain anonymous. He paused, reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket. It seems in the struggle, he lost something. He probably didn't even realize he'd dropped it. Eleanor watched as he pulled out a clear plastic bag, the kind used for evidence. It was sealed at the top. Inside was a small, rectangular object. Her heart gave a strange, painful lurch. Detective Miller held it up, the plastic crinkling under the fluorescent lights. The object inside was white, with a logo and a photograph attached to a broken piece of blue lanyard. The man who saved her disappeared, the detective said, his voice even and professional. But he dropped this. The detective held up the small, clear plastic bag. Through the sterile transparency, Eleanor saw a flash of dark blue and white. It was an object of no importance, a piece of procedural debris in the wake of a nightmare that had almost consumed her world. All that mattered was Lily, safe in her arms, her small hands still clutching the silver butterfly necklace. The child's warmth was the only real thing in the universe. Everything else was just noise. The hum of the hospital lights, the smell of antiseptic, the calm professional voice of the man in the rumpled suit. He disappeared right after the park police arrived, the detective continued, his tone even. Didn't want any attention. The nanny said he was bleeding, but he insisted he was fine. He dropped this during the scuffle. Eleanor's gaze drifted reluctantly from Lily's hair to the evidence bag. Her mind, usually a fortress of instant analysis and sharp connections, was slow and thick with residual terror. She saw the familiar Vance Corp logo on the object inside. A flicker of confusion. Why would her company's logo be here, in the middle of this personal hell? It was a contamination, a detail from a world she had left behind the moment she ran from her office. "What is it?" she asked, her voice raspy. She didn't really care. It was just a question to fill the space, to prove she was still functioning. "An employee ID badge," the detective said, turning it slightly under the fluorescent light. "Seems your hero works for you, Ms. Vance, or at least he did." The words hung in the air, heavy and strange. An employee, one of her own. A vague sense of corporate responsibility pricked at the edges of her relief. She would have to find him, reward him, a large bonus, a promotion, whatever he wanted. It was a problem that could be solved with money, and that was a language Eleanor understood perfectly. It was simple, clean. The nanny mentioned he was wearing a uniform, the detective added, consulting his small notebook. A janitor, she thought, and she was very specific about an injury. She said he had a deep cut on his right forearm. It was bleeding badly. Does that help you identify him? A cut on his right forearm, the hospital corridor, with its pale green walls and scuffed linoleum, suddenly dissolved. For a heartbeat, Eleanor was standing on the cold white marble of the Vance Tower lobby. The air was chilled, echoing with a cavernous silence. She saw a man in a janitor's uniform. His sleeve was torn, and beneath the tear on his forearm was a long, ugly gash, oozing blood onto the faded blue fabric. The memory was so vivid it was dizzying. She could almost feel the severe collar of her blazer against her neck. She could hear the faint, nervous cough of her assistant Thomas, standing just behind her. She could hear her own voice, clipped and cold as glacial ice. "This is a place of business, not a back alley." The words echoed in her head, not as a memory, but as if she were speaking them right now. The detective was still talking. "We'll run the employee number, of course, but if you recognize the name..." Eleanor's focus snapped back to the present. The warmth of Lily in her arms felt distant. The antiseptic smell was suffocating. A cold dread, entirely different from the fear for her daughter, began to uncoil in her stomach. It was a chilling, sickening premonition. "Let me see it," she whispered. Her voice was thin, fragile. The detective, likely mistaking her intensity for eagerness to help, carefully held the bag closer. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes fixated on the plastic card suspended inside. The photo was small, grainy, taken against a sterile white background. A man with tired blue eyes and a face that was neither smiling nor frowning. A face she had seen only hours ago, a face she had looked at with utter contempt. Beneath the photo, the name was printed in stark block letters. Samuel Jones. Samuel Jones, the name hammered into her consciousness like two final nails. It was him. The world tilted on its axis. The memory was no longer a flash. It was a flood, a tidal wave of shame that drowned her. She was back in the lobby, but this time she wasn't the powerful CEO enforcing standards. She was a spectator to her own monstrous cruelty. She saw Sam standing there, his shoulders slumped, not from defiance, but from exhaustion. He had tried to speak, his voice quiet. "Ma'am, I'm sorry I was late. There was an incident at the park." An incident at the park. He had tried to tell her. He had tried to explain. And she had cut him off with a flick of her hand. She hadn't cared about his reasons. Reasons were excuses. Excuses were flaws. And she did not tolerate flaws. Your appearance is unacceptable, her voice echoed in the cavern of her mind. Your tardiness is unacceptable. She watched herself march across the marble, her heels clicking with merciless authority. She saw the flicker of shock, then quiet resignation in his eyes as she reached for his uniform. She remembered the feel of the cheap plastic badge in her fingers, the flimsy lanyard. She remembered the deliberate, theatrical motion of ripping it from his shirt, the small tearing sound of the clip breaking. It was an act of calculated humiliation. She had wanted to make an example of him, to show the dozens of employees watching that no one was exempt from the rules, not even the janitor, especially not the janitor. And now she understood. The incident at the park was Lily. The reason he was late was Lily. The blood on his arm, the blood she had looked at with disgust as a sign of his unprofessionalism, was from protecting Lily. He hadn't been late for his job. He had been saving her daughter's life. He had come from that scene of violence and heroism, bleeding and shaken, and walked straight into a new kind of ambush. An ambush she had laid for him. He had faced down men trying to steal a child, only to be met by her, armed with nothing but cold corporate fury. He had protected the most precious thing in her life, and she had rewarded him by stripping him of his dignity and his livelihood. "Ma'am, Mrs. Vance." The detective's voice was a distant hum, a sound from across an ocean. Eleanor stared at the photo of Samuel Jones, the quiet man she had fired, the hero who had saved her world. The two identities fused into one, and the resulting image was a grotesque monument to her own arrogance. Her entire philosophy, the rigid code of order and perfection that she had built her empire upon, crumbled into dust. Her rules had not prevented chaos. Her rules had punished virtue. Her obsession with control had made her blind. A wave of nausea rose in her throat. She thought of his face as the security guards led him away. He hadn't looked back. He had simply walked out of the building, a man who had done an extraordinary thing, only to be treated like garbage. She had thrown him away. The man who saved her daughter. "Miss Vance, are you all right?" another voice said. A nurse, maybe. Eleanor couldn't answer. She couldn't breathe. The sterile hospital air felt thick as mud. The rhythmic beeping of a machine down the hall was the pounding of a drum at an execution. Her execution, the image of his tired, kind eyes filled her vision. The memory of her own cruel, dismissive words filled her ears. She had told him his employment was terminated. She had told him to get out. The strength in her body evaporated. The fortress she had built around her heart didn't just crack, it imploded, leaving nothing but a black hole of self-loathing. The love for Lily was a burning fire, but the shame was a freezing ocean, and she was caught between the two. Her grip on Lily loosened. Her hands were trembling too violently. She felt a phantom weight in her palm, the ghost of the plastic eye badge she had ripped from his shirt. It felt heavier than the entire Vance Tower. The world began to spin, the pale green wall blurring into streaks of sickly color. The detective's face swam in and out of focus, his mouth moving but forming no words she could understand. The ground felt like it was falling away from her, and she was falling with it. The iron will that had defined her entire adult life snapped. The world spins and the detective's voice fades as Eleanor's knees buckle. The cold of the linoleum floor was the first thing to cut through the fog. It was a sharp, clinical cold that seeped through the fine wool of her suit trousers, a stark and unwelcome reality. Her knees were pressed hard against the polished surface. Her hands, which had managed a global empire just hours before, were splayed out on the floor to keep her from collapsing completely. The air smelled of antiseptic and something faintly sour, like old coffee. Distant sounds blurred together, a meaningless hum of hospital life. A trolley rattled past. A calm voice made an announcement over an intercom. It was all happening in another universe. In her universe, there was only the image in the plastic bag, the familiar Vance Corp logo, the name Samuel Jones, the tired, unassuming face in the photograph, the face of the man she had destroyed this morning, the face of the man who had saved her daughter this afternoon. The two facts crashed together in her mind with the force of a physical impact. and a sound escaped her throat. It was not a word. It was a raw, guttural noise of pure, undiluted agony. Thomas Green was beside her, his own face pale with shock. "Ms. Vance," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Ms. Vance, please, let me help you up. Should I get a doctor?" He reached for her arm, but she flinched away, not from him, but from any human contact. She could not be touched. She was something toxic, something vile. The CEO who built her world on a foundation of unshakable rules had just discovered her entire life was a lie. The lobby of Vance Tower materialized in her memory, so vivid it felt like she was standing there again. The cavernous white space, the echoing marble, the cold, unforgiving light. She saw him, Samuel Jones, standing there, not with defiance, but with a quiet, weary exhaustion. His uniform was torn. There was blood on his arm. She remembered the faint, coppery smell of it mixing with the scent of industrial cleaner. He had tried to speak. His voice was low, respectful, even as he was clearly in pain. "Ma'am, I can explain." Her own voice cut through the memory, sharp and cold as a shard of glass. "Unacceptable." The word echoed in the chambers of her skull. "This is a place of business, Mr. Jones. We have standards." Each word was a lash, not for him, for her. She was whipping herself with the memory of her own cruelty. She had stood there, a monument to merciless efficiency, and savored the silence that fell over the lobby as everyone watched. She had wanted them to see. This is what happens when you break the rules. This is the price of disorder. Another sob ripped through her, violent and convulsive. It doubled her over, her forehead nearly touching the floor. Her carefully constructed chignon had come loose, strands of dark hair falling across her face, sticking to the tears on her cheeks. She was shaking uncontrollably, a tremor that started deep in her bones and refused to stop. This was the chaos she had spent her entire life trying to suppress, not in her company, but in herself. Now it was breaking free, and it was a monster. "He was late," she choked out, the words barely audible. "He was late, because he was saving my daughter." She said it to the floor, to the cold impersonal linoleum. Saying it aloud made it real. It gave the horror a shape, the gash on his arm. It wasn't from a workplace accident, it was from a fight for Lily. While she was in her sterile boardroom, moving pieces on a corporate chessboard, he was in a park, bleeding for her child. He was shielding Lily from the very real monsters her life had created, the enemies she had made with her hostile takeovers and ruthless tactics. Thomas knelt beside her, no longer trying to touch her, but just being there. "Eleanor," he said, using her first name for the first time in his career. His voice was soft, full of a pity she did not deserve. "Breathe, just try to breathe." But she couldn't. Every breath was a camp that brought in the scent of the hospital, which only reminded her where she was, why she was here. Lily was in a room just down the hall, safe, terrified and shaken, but alive. She was clutching the butterfly necklace Eleanor had given her for her 8th birthday. That delicate silver thing, the one symbol of softness in their life, was secure around her daughter's neck because of the man with the torn uniform. The man Eleanor had publicly shamed and cast out. The irony was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, crushing her ribs, making it impossible to draw a full breath. She saw herself again, her hand reaching out. She saw the flick of her wrist as she ripped the ID badge from his shirt, the small, violent sound of the clip breaking. She remembered the look on his face in that final moment. It wasn't anger, it was something far worse. It was a quiet resignation, a deep, hollow disappointment. He had looked at her not as a CEO, but as a person, and in that moment he had seen everything she was, and he had simply turned and walked away, escorted by security like a common criminal. He had accepted her judgment, a judgment she now knew was a monstrous sin. "What have I done?" The whisper was a ghost in the sterile hallway. It was a question aimed at God, at the universe, at anyone who would listen. The pride she had felt in that moment, the cold satisfaction of restoring order, had curdled into a thick, choking self-disgust. She had punished a hero. She had humiliated a savior. In her blind worship of rules, she had committed the greatest injustice of her life. The man who deserved her eternal gratitude received only her scorn. The man who should have been praised was thrown out like garbage. A nurse with kind, tired eyes approached them cautiously. "Ma'am, are you all right? Can we get you to a private room?" Eleanor didn't even look up. She shook her head, a frantic, jerky motion. She deserved this. She deserved the cold floor, the public hallway, the shame of breaking down where strangers could see. A private room was a comfort she had not earned. She needed to feel the hardness of the world she had created for others. She needed this pain. It was the only thing that felt real. The memory of Lily's small, trembling body wrapped in a hospital blanket flashed in her mind, her daughter's tear-streaked face looking up at her. "A man helped me, Mommy. He was really brave." Lily's innocent words were a judgment more damning than any court could deliver. Her own child was praising the man she had fired. Her own child understood a simple human truth that she, with all her intelligence and power, had completely missed. Character was not determined by a pressed uniform or perfect punctuality. It was determined by what you do when no one is watching. Samuel Jones had fought for a child he did not know, for no reward, for no recognition. And his reward had been public disgrace at the hands of that child's mother. A new feeling began to cut through the waves of grief and self-loathing. It was a sharp, urgent panic. He was gone. He had walked out of that building with nothing. She had taken his dignity. The police detective had said he disappeared from the park after the ambulance arrived. He didn't want thanks. He didn't want to be found. And why would he? The only connection he had to this world, to her world, was one of humiliation. He probably thought Vance Corporation, and by extension, Eleanor Vance, was a poison he needed to escape. He was out there somewhere, perhaps injured, certainly without it. He could be anywhere in the sprawling, anonymous city. He could vanish. The thought was unbearable. She could not let that happen. An apology was not enough. A thank you was not enough. This was a debt that could never truly be repaid, but she had to try. She had to look him in the eye and atone for what she had done. It was the only thing that mattered now. All the deals, all the profits, all the power she had accumulated felt like ashes in her mouth. Slowly, shakily, she pushed herself up from the floor. Her limbs were heavy, her body exhausted from the storm of emotion. She leaned against the wall, her expensive suit rumpled and stained with the grime of the hospital floor. Her face was a wreck, her eyes swollen and red, her makeup smeared. The ironclad CEO was gone, replaced by a broken woman. But in her eyes, a flicker of her old fire returned, transformed. It was no longer the cold fire of ambition, but the desperate, burning fire of a mission. She finally looked at Thomas. He flinched slightly at the intensity in her gaze. Her voice when it came was not a command from a boss to an employee. It was a raw, desperate plea from one human being to another, disguised in the only language she knew. It was raspy, broken by tears, but utterly absolute. "Find him," she whispered, the words tearing from her throat. "Find Samuel Jones. Use everything we have." The ride back to Vance Tower was a blur of smeared city lights and the silent, suffocating presence of her own failure. Eleanor did not speak. She did not cry. The storm of tears in the hospital corridor had hollowed her out, leaving behind a cold, burning space. It was a feeling she recognized. It was the same relentless focus that had helped her build an empire from nothing. But this time, the objective was not profit or power. It was atonement. She swept through the pristine lobby, a ghost in a rumpled suit. The evening security guards straightened at her approach, their greetings dying on their lips when they saw her face. It was a mask of stone, but her eyes were wild, haunted. She did not see the polished marble floor. She saw Samuel Jones standing there, his head bowed. She did not hear the quiet hum of the building's climate control. She heard her own voice, sharp and cruel, echoing in the cavernous space. Her penthouse office, usually a sanctuary of order, became a war room within minutes. Thomas Green, his own face pale with exhaustion and vicarious shock, scrambled to keep up. "Get me the head of corporate security," Eleanor commanded, her voice raspy, "and our lead data analyst and the general counsel in my office, now." She tossed her jacket onto a chair, a careless gesture that was completely alien to her. She paced the length of the room, her movements sharp and agitated, like a caged animal. The panoramic view of the city skyline at dusk, A sight that usually filled her with a sense of dominion was now just a collection of indifferent lights. None of it mattered. When her top executives filed in, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern, she did not offer them a seat. She stood before her large communication screen, her back to them. "Our agenda has changed," she said, her voice leaving no room for questions. "All ongoing projects are on indefinite hold. All meetings are canceled. Your only priority, your only task, is to find a man named Samuel Jones." She turned to face them, and the sheer force of her will silenced any potential objections. "He was a janitor, employed by this company until this morning. I want his entire life history on the screen. I want to know every address he has ever lived at, every job he has ever held. I want to know the name of his third-grade teacher, if you can find it. Use every resource, every database, every contact. Hire private investigators, the best ones. Cost is not a factor." Her gaze fell on the head of security. "I want teams on the ground, checking hospitals, clinics, shelters." "He was injured, a cut on his left forearm. He may have sought medical attention." She pointed a trembling finger at the data analyst. "You will find his digital footprint, social media, credit card transactions, phone records. If he so much as buys a coffee, I want to know where and when." The analyst shifted nervously. "Ma'am, with all due respect, privacy laws—" "I don't care about privacy laws," Eleanor snapped, her voice cracking. "I care about finding him. Legal, you will handle any and all fallout. Make it disappear." They stood frozen for a moment, stunned by the raw, personal nature of the command. This was not a hostile takeover. This was a desperate manhunt, ordered by a woman who looked like she was on the verge of collapsing. They simply nodded and hurried out, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by the thick carpet. Eleanor remained alone with Thomas in the darkening office. The only light came from the half-dozen monitors he had set up on her desk, each one a portal into the search. One showed a looping security feed from Northwood Park. Another scrolled through employee databases. A third was a map of the city, ready to be marked with potential locations. She did not sit. She stood behind the desk, her fingers gripping its edge, her eyes scanning the screens with feverish intensity. Lily was safe. Her daughter was upstairs in the penthouse with the nanny, sleeping, a security detail posted outside her door. Eleanor had seen her for only a moment, a quick, fierce hug before she had descended back into this self-made hell. She couldn't bear to look at her daughter's innocent face, knowing she had personally and cruelly punished the man who had kept her safe. Hours bled into one another. The city outside went to sleep, but Vance Tower's top floor burned with a sleepless, frantic energy. Thomas brought her coffee, which she drank without tasting. He brought reports from the investigators. "Nothing yet, ma'am," he would say, his voice gentle. His social security number flags him as a military veteran. Decorated, but his records since discharge are sealed, likely by his own request. "Unseal them, Dici," Eleanor ordered without looking at him. We can't, ma'am. That would require a federal warrant." Her head snapped up. "Then get one." Thomas swallowed hard. "On what grounds?" Eleanor's face contorted. The shame was a physical thing, a sickness in her stomach. "On the grounds that I am a fool," she whispered, the words barely audible. She turned away, unable to meet his gaze. Another update, hours later. "We checked the address on his employment application. It's an old one. The current tenants have never heard of him." A dead end. Each one was a small, sharp blow. "We have a possible credit card transaction from 6 months ago," the data analyst reported over the intercom. "A small grocery store on the west side." "Send a team there now," Eleanor commanded. "Show his picture to everyone." An hour later, the report came back. No one recognized him. The man was a ghost. He had built a life of deliberate anonymity, and he had been successful. The vast, powerful machine of Vance Corporation, a machine that could move markets and crush competitors, was proving useless against the quiet life of one good man. Sometime before dawn, Thomas's own phone rang. He looked at the caller ID, his eyes widening in panic. "Ma'am," he began hesitantly. "It's Mr. Sterling from the board. He says the Tokyo deal is about to collapse. He needs your authorization to—" Eleanor did not even turn around. Does it have to do with Samuel Jones? She asked, her voice flat and dead. No, ma'am, it's the... Then it doesn't matter. But ma'am, this is a 9-figure deal. Your personal capital is on the line. For the first time, she turned and looked directly at him. Her eyes were hollowed out pits of exhaustion and guilt. Thomas, she said, and the use of his first name was more shocking than any shout. Do you understand what I did? I stood on a marble floor and I destroyed a man for being 5 minutes late. I took his dignity because it inconvenienced me. And that same man with a bleeding arm stood between my daughter and a monster. Her voice broke. That 9-figure deal is worthless paper. Lily is all that matters, and the man who saved her is gone because of me. Find him. Nothing else matters. Thomas simply nodded, his own eyes now glistening. He hung up the phone on one of the most powerful men in international finance without a word. The sun began to rise, casting long gray shadows across the city. Eleanor had not slept. She had not moved from her station. The image of the lobby was burned into her mind. She forced herself to see it. The way Sam had flinched when she'd ripped the badge from his shirt. The quiet shame in his eyes as security had led him away. He hadn't argued. He hadn't fought back. He had simply accepted his fate, another casualty of her rigid, unforgiving world. The memory was her penance. She would not allow herself to look away from it. The search teams were hitting brick walls everywhere. No recent hospital visits matched his description. No shelter had a record of him. His Veterans Association had a file but refused to release any information without his consent. It felt hopeless. The city was too big, and he was too small, too determined to be unseen. Despair, cold and heavy, began to settle in Eleanor's chest. What if they never found him? What if he had just disappeared? How could she live with that? How could she ever look her daughter in the eye again? She finally sank into her chair, the fight momentarily draining out of her. She stared at the screensaver on her primary monitor, a photo of Lily on a swing at the park, her head thrown back in laughter. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered to the picture. "I'm so sorry." Suddenly, the door to her office burst open. It was Thomas, but not the timid, careful assistant she knew. His hair was a mess, his tie was askew, and he was breathing heavily, clutching a faded manila folder. He wasn't supposed to enter without being announced. Eleanor's head snapped up, a spark of anger ready to ignite, but it died when she saw the look in his eyes. It was not fear, it was discovery. "Ma'am," he gasped, rushing to her desk. He slapped the folder down, flipping it open. It was not a digital printout. It was old paper filled out by hand, a physical copy of an initial hiring form, pulled from the deep archives in the basement. "We've been looking at digital records. We missed this. It's from his original application. It's different from the one in the main system." Eleanor leaned forward, her heart starting to pound against her ribs, a painful, hopeful rhythm. Thomas's finger stabbed at a single line on the yellowed page. It was under the section labeled Current Residents. "The private investigator I sent to the archives found it 10 minutes ago," Thomas said, his voice trembling with excitement. "He didn't check it against our systems. He just drove there. The building superintendent confirmed it. A man matching his description lives there, or at least he did." Eleanor stared at the handwritten address. It was not in an affluent suburb or a trendy downtown high-rise. It was a street name she did not recognize, in a working-class district on the other side of town, a world away from the gleaming steel and glass of Vance Tower. The address was just a slip of paper in Thomas Green's trembling hand. Eleanor snatched it without a word, her eyes scanning the ink as if it were a coded message. She bypassed her driver, who stood waiting by the polished black town car, and headed straight for the private executive garage. Her own car, a sleek silver coupe she rarely drove, sat waiting under the cool fluorescent lights. The keys felt foreign in her palm, small and sharp against her skin. Thomas had started to say something, to offer assistance, but she had already turned away. The sound of his voice dissolving in the vast, empty space. The engine roared to life with a clean, powerful growl that felt obscene in her current state. She pulled out of the garage and into the late afternoon traffic, her knuckles white on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. For the first 10 blocks, she was still in her world. Gleaming glass towers reflected a sky of pale blue and gold. The streets were clean, the pedestrians well-dressed, moving with the purpose of people who knew where they were going and why it mattered. This was the city she had conquered, a landscape of order and ambition she had built and mastered. Then she crossed the river. The bridge was a clear line of demarcation. On the other side, the chrome and glass gave way to brick and rusted steel. The buildings grew shorter, huddled closer together as if for warmth. Storefronts had hand-painted signs instead of digital displays. The clean, antiseptic smell of the financial district was replaced by the exhaust of city buses and the faint, greasy scent of street food. Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had flown over this part of the city countless times, looking down from the window of a private jet. It was an abstract pattern from above, a grid of anonymous lives. Now she was in it. The car's navigation system, a calm and collected female voice, directed her through a labyrinth of unfamiliar streets. Her mind was a chaotic storm. She imagined finding him. She pictured his apartment, expecting something sparse but clean, like the man himself. She imagined knocking on his door and the moment he would open it. What would she see in his eyes? Surprise? Anger? Or worse, nothing at all. The vacant, resigned look he'd had when security led him away. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. What could she possibly say? "I'm sorry" was a phrase for spilled coffee, not for the complete and utter destruction of a man's dignity. "Thank you" felt like an insult, a transaction. "Here is my gratitude in exchange for my daughter's life." She gripped the wheel tighter. The shame was a physical presence in the car, thick and suffocating. It was hotter than the air blowing from the vents. It had a weight that pressed down on her chest. She, Eleanor Vance, who prided herself on seeing every angle, on anticipating every move, had been so blind. She had stood on her pedestal of rules and procedure, casting judgment down on a man who was bleeding from defending her own child. The memory of her own voice in the lobby was a torment, cold, sharp, and utterly devoid of humanity. She had stripped him of his gras, his pride, in front of the world she commanded, and he had simply taken it. He had absorbed her cruelty with a quiet dignity that now seemed monumental. He had not fought back. He had not argued. He had just looked at her. The navigation voice announced she was approaching her destination. She slowed the car, her eyes scanning the building numbers. They were old, faded, some missing entirely. The street was narrower here, lined with cars parked half on the curb. Children were playing a game with a worn-out soccer ball, their shouts echoing between the brick walls. They stopped and stared as her silver coupe glided past, a spaceship from another planet. Eleanor felt their eyes on her, and for the first time in her adult life, she felt like an intruder. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and deeply, deeply ashamed of the luxury that insulated her. She found the building. It was a 4-story walk-up of dark, soot-stained brick with a heavy wooden door and windows that looked like tired eyes. A few plastic bags of trash were piled near the entrance. There was no doorman, no security desk, just a row of tarnished brass mailboxes in a dimly lit vestibule. The air inside was thick with the smell of boiled cabbage, dust, and something vaguely metallic, like old pipes. Eleanor's expensive leather heels clicked loudly on the cracked linoleum floor, each step an announcement of her otherness. She found his name, S. Jones, typed on a small strip of paper and slipped into the slot for apartment 3, or 3rd floor. She pushed the inner door open and started to climb the stairs. The wooden banister was sticky to the touch. The walls were a pale, sickly yellow, scarred with dark smudges and the ghosts of old picture frames. From behind one door, a baby was crying. From another, a television blared a game show. These were the sounds of a life she knew nothing about. This was the world her daughter's hero returned to every night, a world she had so carelessly shattered. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. A part of her, the cold CEO part that had been her armor for so long, wanted to turn around. It whispered that this was a mistake, that she should have sent Thomas, that she could solve this with money, with a settlement, with a carefully worded letter from her lawyers. But a deeper, stronger part of her, the mother who had felt her daughter to tremble in her arms at the hospital, pushed her forward. She had to do this herself. She owed him that. She owed it to Lily. She reached the third-floor landing. It was quieter up here. There were only two doors, 3A and 3B. She walked to his door. It was painted a dark, peeling green. She stood before it for a long moment, trying to compose herself, trying to rehearse the words that still wouldn't come. Her hand felt impossibly heavy as she lifted it. She took a breath and knocked. The sound was small, swallowed by the oppressive quiet of the hallway. She waited. 10 seconds? 30? A minute. Nothing. No footsteps from within. No shuffling sound. Just the steady, maddening hum of a refrigerator somewhere in the building. She knocked again, louder this time, her knuckles rapping sharply against the wood. Jones? Samuel? It's Eleanor Vance. Her own name sounded alien in this place. Arrogant. The silence that answered was absolute. A cold dread, far worse than the fear she had felt in the car, began to seep into her bones. He wasn't there. Hope, the fragile little flame she had nurtured all the way across the city, flickered and died. She felt a desperate urge to pound on the door, to scream his name, but she restrained herself. She leaned her forehead against the cool, rough surface of the door, closing her eyes. It was over. She was too late. Just as she was about to turn away, the door to apartment 3A creaked open a few inches. A sliver of a face appeared in the gap. An elderly woman with sharp, suspicious eyes and a cloud of white hair peered out at her. "He's not there," the woman said, her voice raspy. Eleanor straightened up, smoothing down her suit jacket in a useless, reflexive gesture. "Do you know when he'll be back? Did he say where he was going?" The woman opened the door a little wider, revealing a floral housecoat and a pair of worn slippers. She gave Eleanor a long, slow look, taking in the expensive suit, the perfect hair, the air of wealth that clung to her like a perfume. "You from that company? The one that fired him?" The question was a physical blow. Eleanor flinched. "Yes," she managed to say, her own voice barely a whisper. "I am." The woman's expression hardened. It wasn't hostile, but it was filled with a deep, weary disappointment. "He left, hours ago, just after he got back this afternoon." "Left?" Eleanor's mind struggled to process the word. "Left for where?" "Didn't say," the woman replied, shaking her head slowly. "I saw him in the hall. He had that cut on his arm all bandaged up. He was carrying a single duffel bag. That's all. I asked him if everything was all right. He's always such a quiet, polite man, you know. Always helps me with my groceries." She paused, her eyes looking past Eleanor, remembering. "He just looked at me. He looked so tired. More tired than I've ever seen him. And he said, 'There's nothing left for me here, Mrs. Gable. Time to move on.' Nothing left for me here." The words echoed in the silent hallway, each one a hammer blow against Eleanor's heart. It wasn't just the job, it was everything. She had taken his livelihood, and in doing so, she had taken his home. She had made him feel so worthless, so discarded, that he believed he had no reason to stay. The quiet life he had built for himself, the anonymity he clearly cherished, she had destroyed it all in a single cruel moment of arrogance. He hadn't just been fired, he had been erased. "He said nothing else?" Eleanor asked, her voice cracking. "No forwarding address? No city?" Mrs. Gable shook her head again, a look of pity now softening her sharp features. "No, dear. He just walked down those stairs and didn't look back. I'm sorry." She hesitated, then closed her door softly, leaving Eleanor alone in the dim, yellowed light. Eleanor stood frozen, staring at the green door. The finality of it was crushing. He was gone. A ghost. A man who had saved the most precious thing in her life had vanished into the vast, sprawling city, and it was her fault. The search, the mobilization of her entire company, the desperate, high-stakes race across town, it had all been for nothing. She had been searching for a man who was running away from her. The weight of her failure was immense, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. Tears she didn't know she had left began to well in her eyes, blurring the peeling paint of the door in front of her. She had lost. In the one negotiation that had ever truly mattered, she had failed completely. There was nothing more to do, No one else to call, no database to scour. There was only this empty hallway and the deafening sound of her own regret. She finally turned to leave, each movement feeling slow and heavy, as if she were wading through water. Her gaze fell to the floor, to the small gap beneath Sam's door. And then she saw it, a small piece of white paper almost completely hidden in the shadows. It looked like it had been slipped under the door, but perhaps hadn't made it all the way through. It wasn't a bill. It wasn't an official notice. It was something else. Her hand trembled as she bent down, her fingers closing around the thin sheet. She lifted it into the faint light from the hallway window. It was a drawing, a child's drawing, done in bright, waxy crayon. It depicted a clumsy, colorful butterfly, with lopsided wings of blue and purple, and a body made from a single yellow smear. It was innocent, it was imperfect, and Eleanor recognized it instantly. It was the exact likeness of the sapphire pendant that hung around her daughter's neck. Lily must have drawn this for him. A small, simple thank you from a child to her hero, and he had left it behind. Or perhaps he had never even seen it. Lying here on the dirty floor, a forgotten token of gratitude. Eleanor's breath hitched, and a single hot tear fell from her eye, landing right in the center of the paper. It blurred the crayon into a smudge of heartbreaking color. The drive back to Vance Tower was a slow crawl through a city that no longer felt like hers. Each red light was a moment suspended in failure. Each passing car a reminder that the world kept moving, indifferent to the chasm that had opened in her life. Eleanor sat in the back of her silent Maybach, the buttery leather cold against her skin. She wasn't looking out the window at the glittering skyline she had conquered. Her entire universe was contained in the small, folded piece of paper in her hand. It was a child's drawing, a butterfly rendered in waxy, uneven strokes of crayon. One wing was slightly larger than the other. The colors were a chaotic, joyful blend of purple and yellow. It was Lily's work. She recognized the exuberant, clumsy lines immediately, and it was the last thing Samuel Jones had touched before vanishing. A final, silent message left on the cold floor outside his empty apartment. A piece of her daughter's innocence, entrusted to him, and now returned to her like an indictment. She smoothed the paper over and over with her thumb, the pressure just enough to feel the texture of the crayon, but not enough to smudge it. Her hand was steady, but her heart felt like a frantic bird trapped inside her ribs. The hope that had propelled her across the city had evaporated, leaving behind the bitter ash of despair. He was gone, and she had sent him away. When the car slid to a stop in the private garage beneath her tower, she didn't wait for the driver. She moved with a strange new purpose, not the sharp, commanding stride of a chief executive, but the heavy, deliberate walk of someone carrying an invisible weight. The lobby, the very stage of her monstrous pride, was empty and silent. The white marble gleamed under the recessed lighting. It felt like a mausoleum. She could still see him standing there, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of quiet disbelief as she tore his dignity away. The echo of her own voice, cold and sharp, seemed to hang in the sterile air. She flinched, a physical recoil from a memory that was now a part of the building itself. In her penthouse office, the panoramic view of the city offered no comfort. It was just a collection of lights, a vast, sprawling map of places where Sam was not. She walked to her desk, the glass surface reflecting her pale, drawn face. She placed the crayon butterfly carefully under the soft glow of her desk lamp, as if it were a priceless artifact. It was the only spot of warmth and color in the entire cavernous room. Her assistant, Thomas, stood nervously by the door, his presence a quiet question. He had seen the look on her face when she returned. He knew the search had failed. Eleanor ignored him for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the drawing. Then she turned, her eyes clear and resolute. "Thomas," she said, her voice quiet but firm, lacking its usual icy edge. "I need a bed in here, a child's bed. I want it assembled before Lily arrives from the hospital." Thomas blinked, startled by the request. A bed. In her office. It was a breach of every protocol, a violation of the sacred separation between her work and her life. But he saw the raw, unyielding pain in her eyes and simply nodded. "Of course, Eleanor, right away." He backed out of the room, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. While a team worked with hushed efficiency to assemble a small, elegant bed of white lacquered wood in the corner of her office, Eleanor made arrangements. She spoke to the hospital, clearing Lily's release. She spoke to the nanny, telling her to bring Lily directly to the office, along with a few of her favorite books and her softest pajamas. She worked with a mechanical focus, each task a small stone she could place on the path to some unknown destination. Control was the only thing she understood, and right now, controlling these small details was all she had left. When Lily arrived, she was small and quiet in the vastness of the office. She was clutching her silver butterfly necklace, the one Eleanor had given her for her last birthday. Her eyes were still wide with a fear she did not fully understand. Eleanor knelt, her expensive suit wrinkling on the floor, and wrapped her arms around her daughter. She held her for a long time, breathing in the scent of her hair, the simple, clean smell of innocence. "You're safe now," Eleanor whispered into her ear, the words a promise to Lily and a vow to herself. "You are always safe with me." She helped Lily change into her pajamas and tucked her into the new bed. The sight of her small daughter curled up under a soft duvet against a backdrop of global stock tickers and city lights was the most surreal and necessary thing she had ever seen. She sat in a chair beside the bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of Lily's chest. She stayed there for hours, long after the sun had set and the city had become a river of light. The tower was silent around her. The frantic energy of the workday was gone, leaving only the low hum of servers and ventilation. For the first time in years, Eleanor Vance was not working. She was not planning a takeover or dismantling a competitor or reviewing quarterly reports. She was simply standing guard over her child, her mind a maelstrom of regret. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, Samuel Jones, his tired, kind eyes, the faded scars on his hands. The way he stood, not with defiance, but with a deep, weary resignation as she verbally dismantled him in front of the entire lobby. She had called him a disgrace to her company, a man with no respect for the rules. She had judged him on the surface, on his tardiness and his torn uniform, and in doing so had revealed a rot in her own soul. He had been injured saving her daughter, and she had punished him for it. The thought was a physical blow, and she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob, careful not to wake Lily. The guilt was no longer a wave that threatened to drown her. It had settled into something heavier, something colder, a stone in her gut. It was not enough to feel sorry. It was not enough to find him and give him money. That would be an insult, an extension of the same arrogance that caused this nightmare. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she had to face what she had done, truly face it. When she was sure Lily was deep in sleep, Eleanor rose from the chair. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She walked to her desk, her reflection a ghostly shape in the floor-to-ceiling glass. She pressed the intercom. Thomas's voice answered immediately, alert and waiting. "Yes, Eleanor?" "Thomas," she began, her own voice sounding alien in the quiet room. "I want you to pull the security footage from the main lobby. From this morning, at 9:15. There was a pause, a long silence filled with unspoken questions. "Ma'am," he finally asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Are you sure?" "I am," she said. "Patch it through to the main screen into my office. Now." She didn't wait for a reply. She clicked off the intercom and turned to face the massive wall-sized monitor that usually displayed market data and video conferences. It was a screen built for power and intimidation. Tonight it would be her confessional. The screen flickered to life. The image was crisp, high definition. It was the lobby, her lobby. She saw the timestamp in the corner. She saw the employees milling about. And then she saw him. Samuel Jones walking slowly towards the reception desk, his arm held carefully at his side. The image was so clear she could see the dark stain of blood seeping through the makeshift bandage on his forearm. She saw the exhaustion etched on his face. Then she saw herself, a figure of sharp angles and cold fury striding into the frame. She watched, motionless, as the version of herself from that morning confronted him. She heard her own voice, amplified by the office's sound system, each word a perfectly enunciated shard of ice. "This is Vance Corporation, Mr. Jones, and not a back alley clinic. We have standards here." She saw Sam try to speak, didn't explain, and she saw herself cut him off with a flick of her wrist. She watched his face fall, the hope in his eyes dying as he realized he would not be heard. The worst part was watching herself reach out and rip the ID badge from his uniform. The plastic card, his name, his identity, torn away with such casual contempt. She saw the flicker of pain and humiliation in his eyes, a look she had been too blind and too arrogant to notice at the time. He had absorbed the blow with a quiet dignity that now seemed monumental. She had ordered security to remove him as if he were a piece of trash. And he had walked away without a single backward glance, leaving her to stand alone in her perfect, orderly, and soulless world. The footage ended. The screen went black, reflecting her own haunted face. She stood there in the crushing silence, the only light coming from the lamp on her desk, illuminating the crayon butterfly. There were no more tears. The horror was too deep for that. She had not just been wrong. She had been cruel. She had wielded her power not to build, but to break a good man, the very man who had shielded her daughter from true monsters. The CEO in her, the ruthless architect of a global empire, had died in that moment. What was left was a woman staring into the abyss of her own making. She knew what she had to do. Finding him was no longer enough. An apology in private would be a coward's act. The humiliation was public. The atonement had to be public. She had to tear down the idol of Eleanor Vance, the Iron CEO, in the same arena where she had built it. She had to show the world, and more importantly, herself, that she understood the depth of her failure. She reached for the phone, her hand no longer trembling. Her fingers dialed Thomas's extension with a newfound, terrifying clarity. He answered on the first ring. "Thomas," she said, her voice low and steady, carrying a weight that made her loyal assistant sit up straighter in his own darkened office. "Cancel my morning, clear the entire schedule." She took a breath. "I want you to arrange an all-hands press conference for tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock in the main auditorium, all employees, all divisions, and send an invitation to every major news outlet in the city." The heat from the stage lights felt like an accusation. Below Eleanor Vance, her company sat in a vast, waiting silence. Her senior executives filled the front rows, their faces a mix of loyalty and confusion. Behind them, hundreds of employees and the press watched, their cameras poised like weapons. For 20 years, she had commanded rooms like this, armored in data and authority. Today, the armor felt like paper. In the front row, her advisor Thomas sat stiffly, his eyes mirroring her own terror. He had begged her to issue a press release to let the public relations team handle it, but a statement could be spun. The truth, delivered from her own mouth, was the only currency she had left. She leaned toward the microphone, the sound of her own breathing ragged in her ears. She had rehearsed nothing. A script would be another lie. "2 days ago," she began, her voice thin and unsteady. The room became impossibly still. "2 days ago, in the lobby of this building, I destroyed a man's livelihood." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. She kept her eyes fixed on a point at the back of the hall. "His name is Samuel Jones. He was a janitor. He was late for his shift. His uniform was torn, and he had an injury on his arm." She forced herself to relive the moment. The memory seared into her mind. "I did not ask him what happened. I saw that a rule had been broken. And so, in front of his colleagues, I made an example of him." Her voice hitched. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the burn of tears. This was not about her pain. It was about his. "I told him he was a disgrace to my company. I tore his identification from his shirt. I had security escort him from the building. I did this because I believed that rules were more important than people." The silence in the auditorium was now absolute, heavy and suffocating. "I went back to my office," she continued, her voice gaining a cold edge of self-loathing. "I felt nothing. I registered it as a problem that had been solved." She let that hang in the air, wanting them to understand her callousness. "An hour later, I learned that my daughter, my 8-year-old daughter, Lily, had been the target of a kidnapping attempt." A collective gasp swept the room. The police had kept the details quiet at her request. "She is safe. She is unharmed. She is safe because a stranger intervened. A man saw what was happening, and he fought for her. He sustained injuries in the process. He saved her life. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. The police told me this hero disappeared before they could thank him, but he left something behind. She reached into her pocket and held up a small evidence bag. The light caught the plastic, illuminating the laminated card inside. He dropped his identification, the same badge I had ripped from his shirt just 1 hour earlier. The revelation landed like a physical blow. A wave of dawning horror washed over the faces before her. The man I fired, the man I humiliated, was Samuel Jones, Eleanor said, her voice a broken whisper. He was late because he was saving my daughter's life. The reason his uniform was torn, the reason he was bleeding, was because he was protecting the only thing in this world that I love. She looked down, unable to face them. The shame was a physical weight. I have spent the last day trying to find him. I went to his home. He is gone. I took his job, and I took his dignity. She raised her head, tears flowing freely now, her gaze desperate. This is a plea. Mr. Samuel Jones, if you can hear this, I am sorry. What I did was cruel. You are a hero. There are no excuses for my actions. Only a profound and unending regret. She took a deep breath. I am publicly pledging that I will not rest. My company's resources, my personal resources, will be dedicated to finding you, not to clear my conscience, but so that my daughter and I can thank you properly. Her speech was over. The camera flashes had stopped. She stood exposed under the lights, waiting for the judgment she deserved. The stock would plummet. The board might demand her resignation. She had prepared for all of it. Then a subtle movement occurred at the far end of the auditorium. A single person, unnoticed until now, shifted near the main entrance doors. A few heads in the back rows turned. Eleanor squinted, the lights blinding her. She could only make out a silhouette against the dim corridor behind. It was a man. He wore no suit. As her eyes adjusted, details emerged. The figure wore simple, worn clothes. His hands were clasped loosely in front of him. He was not looking at the crowd. He was looking directly at her. And though she could not yet see his face, she saw him take a small, hesitant step forward into the light. A quiet rustle started at the back of the auditorium, a ripple of whispers that spread faster than fire. Heads began to turn one by one, then an entire rows. The relentless flash of cameras, which had been aimed squarely at the stage, pivoted toward the main entrance. Eleanor's words caught in her throat. The carefully prepared sentences on the teleprompter dissolved into a meaningless blur. Her world, which had just been a vast sea of faces, suddenly shrank to a single point. There, standing hesitantly by the doors, was Samuel Jones. He was dressed in a worn work jacket and simple trousers, looking small and out of place beneath the grand architecture of the hall. A clean white bandage was wrapped around his forearm. He held himself with a quiet stillness, his blue eyes scanning the enormous room, not with anger, but with a weary confusion. He looked like a man who had taken a wrong turn and ended up in a world where he did not belong. For a heart-stopping second, Eleanor's mind went completely blank. The CEO, the strategist, the iron-fisted ruler of a global empire was gone. All that was left was a woman staring at the face of her own terrible failure. She placed the microphone carefully back onto its stand. The soft thud echoed in the sudden, profound silence. The entire room, filled with hundreds of employees and journalists, held its breath. Eleanor stepped away from the podium, her expensive heels making no sound on the plush carpet. She walked to the edge of the stage, a drop of only a few feet that felt like a cliff. Without hesitation, she descended the steps to the main floor. The crowd parted for her as if by an invisible command. Every person she passed averted their eyes, giving her a wide berth, creating a silent corridor that stretched the entire length of the auditorium. That walk was the longest journey of her life. With each step, the marble floors of the lobby flashed in her mind. She saw Sam's face, stunned and humiliated. She heard her own voice, cold and sharp, severing a man's dignity for the sake of a rule. The crumpled crayon drawing of a butterfly felt heavy in her pocket, a small, fragile piece of evidence against her. She was not walking toward an employee. She was walking toward the man who had faced violence to protect her child, while she had faced him with nothing but contempt. She deserved whatever he had for her, a shout, a curse, or his back as he walked away forever. She braced herself for the impact. Finally, she stood before him. The space between them was electric. They were an impossible contrast. The titan of industry in her perfectly tailored suit and the quiet veteran in his faded jacket. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the gulf of class and circumstance that separated them. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched her, his gaze steady. There was no hatred in his eyes. There was only a deep, profound sorrow, a quiet question that asked why any of this had to happen. In that moment, Eleanor understood the uselessness of her power. What could she offer him? His job back? It was an insult. A check with a staggering number of zeros? It was transactional garbage. A reward, a promotion, a new life. All of it was just more of the same world that had chewed him up and spat him out. All her wealth and influence were worthless here. The only thing she had left to give was the one thing she had guarded her entire life, her own broken, humbled truth. Tears she didn't know were coming began to stream down her face, tracing paths through her perfect makeup. They were not tears of performance, but of a dam breaking inside her. Her voice was a choked whisper, raw and stripped of all authority. "I am so sorry," she said, the words tearing from her throat. Her gaze met his, pleading for nothing, only offering the confession. "Thank you." Sam looked at her for a long moment. The flashes from the cameras seemed to freeze them in time. He looked past her shoulder for just a second, as if seeing a ghost in the crowd. Perhaps he saw a battlefield from long ago, or a face he had lost. He saw a world of pain and sacrifice that no one in this room could ever comprehend. Then his eyes returned to hers. A flicker of something shifted in his expression. It was not forgiveness. It was not pity. It was something far deeper. It was understanding. He gave a small, deliberate nod. It was barely a movement, but for Eleanor, it was everything. It was an acknowledgement, a signal that he had heard her, that he saw the person behind the monster. In that single quiet gesture, the vast canyon between their two worlds was closed. The crushing weight on her soul did not vanish, but it became bearable. Suddenly, a small figure darted out from behind Thomas Green near the side of the stage. Lily, her butterfly necklace glinting under the lights, ran down the aisle. She didn't run to her mother. She ran straight to Sam. Without a word, she wrapped her small arms around his legs, hugging him tightly. "You saved me," she said, her voice muffled against his trousers. Sam started, looking down at the small child clinging to him. A gentle, unpracticed smile touched his lips. He slowly reached down and rested his hand on her head, his calloused fingers sinking into her soft hair. He looked up, his eyes meeting Eleanor's over her daughter's head. The look they shared now was different. It was no longer the accuser and the accused. It was two people bound by the fierce, protective love for the child between them. Eleanor stood frozen, watching the man she had destroyed comfort the daughter he had saved. The world of contracts, of profit margins, of hostile takeovers, faded into meaningless noise. The flashes of the cameras continued, a silent storm of light. But the story was no longer theirs to tell. In the center of the silent storm, all that mattered was a quiet nod and a child's simple, trusting embrace. What would you have done? One line in the comments, let's argue it out together. Where did the story catch you? Which scene made you stop and think? A small like is a small move, but it's a big support for this channel. See you in the next story. Subscribe so you don't miss it.